Hello all, welcome to Napoleon Q&A 2. Not too much to say about this one, just going to do what I did before, answer and ramble about things I vaguely know about. I've taken your questions from the Q&A post on the channel, comments in videos, and a couple of emails. So without further ado, we'll get into it. Ivan asks if I'd prefer to observe or participate in the events that the channel covers. I think 100% yes, I'd love to watch and experience the Napoleonic Wars, but not as a participant at all. But if I could travel back in time and watch, I'm gone, I'm out of here. But yeah, not taking part and being shot at all. Most of the things I'd like to see actually aren't all that dangerous, like I'd love to see a council meeting or a diplomatic summit, like a soiree, something like that, like a big sort of event like that. The coronation would actually be quite like Napoleon's coronation. As far as battles, there's a big difference between being a participant soldier and then actually truly witnessing and seeing the battle. Like very few are lucky to have a vantage point, like a literal physical vantage point where you can watch things unfold and actually sort of understand what's actually going on. But yeah, if I could, you'd do a Goethe, rock up with a packed lunch and a telescope and watch the battle from a hill nearby. That'd be great. Generous G asks why no one used bow and arrows. Well, the simple answer is that they had guns, which shoot further, they're easier to use, they hit harder. But bows and arrows were used extensively by Russian and Turkish regulars. A lot of the auxiliary and levy troops arrayed against the French in Egypt, in Syria, in the Levant were armed with bows and arrows. And then, of course, in Russia, you've got Bashkirs, Tatars, Cossacks, Kazakhs, I'm sure other ethnic groups. But in Marbo's memoirs, he has an anecdote about being attacked by bows and arrows, and he describes why they aren't very effective. But maybe there's a case to be made for a more serious outfit of trained bowmen, but ultimately it's a moot point when you can just shoot a guy instead. But yeah, I'll put up a couple of quotes from Marbo's memoirs, but the upside is basically they just weren't particularly dangerous. Saidan Dathrahan has a question on the Marshals and about what should be made of them. Great question. This is one of those enduring questions of the era when it comes to Napoleon's command style and the assessment of the Marshals. Like, how much leeway should they have had? How effective were they in independent commands? Do they warrant a generally positive historical appraisal? Generally, early on, whatever Napoleon and his Marshals were doing was working. But as you point out, when France is really stressed, that's when things start to break down. And perhaps that's the best takeaway. The command and control system was effective, but heavily personalized and centralized, dependent on Napoleon, which was a strength when he was at his best and a vulnerability when he wasn't. There's also a whole case to be made about how Napoleon, in trying to micromanage and control everything he could, or at least be in the loop on every command decision, didn't let his marshals and generals develop as fully as they might have if they had been given a freer hand. Then again, there's a lot of really boneheaded decisions from big personalities that do seem to justify Napoleon keeping a close eye on them. But yes, this is a very big and very complicated topic. Like entire historical corpuses have been devoted to it. Adair asks where to start studying the French Marshals. This one's pretty easy. Plenty of books that cover the lives of the Marshals in general terms. There's biographies written about most, if not all of them. I can't imagine it's not all of them at this stage. Fortunately, there's also the correspondence of all the Marshals collated in various places, also published memoirs from a couple of them. Like Massena published his recollections and Davout's papers were published by his family. So yeah, even when they died beforehand, you can still read a lot of their papers or their notations, their letters. I'll pop a couple of links in the description. As for your second question on who of the Marshals would make the best protagonist for a film or a book. For a book, any one of them has an interesting enough life to make a very good historical fiction novel. But for a movie specifically, it has to be Marat or Ney, if only because they have that very neat button ending with their deaths. And also, half the scenes of the film would just be, they would have the audience asking like, really? That happened? Because I know this isn't directly related to the question, but it does make me think of part of the reason why the Napoleon movie recently was so disappointing, or fairly recent. Was it 23? Anyway, but yeah, it had so little of any of the truly bonkers stuff that happened that would look great on camera, make for a great story, but also has the benefit of being legit, being real. Like if you did a Marat bio, he could simultaneously be a hero, a villain, a rake, a lover, coward, a brave fighter, a moron, a genius. Just a very complex and interesting character to write and to act. And you wouldn't have to work hard or suspend disbelief to do it authentically as well. P. Howard asks whether I think Napoleon was a genius. No, I don't think I've answered this question directly before. I've certainly made reference to others thinking Napoleon was a genius, but I'm not one of them. For as much of a cop-out answer as this is, I don't think there's such a thing as a genius. Napoleon was a very intelligent, very capable person in the right place at the right time to have a massive, outsized, very long-lasting historical impact. But is that because he was some sort of singular, once-in-a-generation genius? Because his brain was literally bigger or worked faster than yours or mine? It's like with any genius or great man throughout history, where if you really dig into it, their ideas or actions or accomplishments didn't just spring up fully formed out of like a pure intellectualism, but the usual things like collaboration, study, hard work, trial and error, compromise, evolution, just random chance at times. And yeah, absolutely no different with Napoleon. Like, he's surrounded by people who could justifiably be called geniuses, or at least very talented in their own specific fields, like Berthier in organization and communication, Kurenko in foreign policy, Fouché in spycraft, Malbois and Gaudin in economics and finance, just off the top of my head. Like, not one of Napoleon's ideas or schemes or reforms or battle plans or anything didn't have other people involved and helping to bring it to fruition in what is ultimately a long and difficult process. But it's a lot easier to conceive of a pipeline of creation that kind of goes, genius has perfect idea, genius communicates perfect idea implemented perfectly. And that conception does a lot of damage to historical understanding because it's putting the cart before the horse, like going, it worked, therefore the idea must have been good in the first place, when in reality a lot of happenstance and assistance from things well beyond one person's control goes into the outcome. It also causes another big problem, which is that failures are misconstrued as failures of genius and not as they actually are, big, complicated decision-making processes that have usually multiple points of both success and failure, and invariably some sort of complex, systemic or institutional cause. Rush P asks how tall Napoleon really was. Over 5 foot, somewhere between 5'2" and 5'4". Wéry, one of Napoleon's aides, recalled that Napoleon was about the same height as Claude Duroc and other members of his staff, and the Maison corroborate the averageness, or maybe the slight below averageness, of Napoleon's height. People were shorter on average back in the day, so at his height, yeah, Napoleon was well within norms. 2 questions from Abdurrahman Kuchuk. First, would the Bourbon Restoration happen before 1800 if there was no Napoleon, and would it last? No, probably not. After the execution of Louis and Marie Antoinette and the emigration of most of the French nobility, including all the Bourbons and all the Bourbon cadet branches and affiliate branches, the Bourbons didn't literally drop off the face of the earth, but they certainly didn't have much actual presence. Louis XVII was named by King Louis XVI, his father, but died in French custody, so seniority passed to Louis XVI's brother, the Comte de Provence, who then became Louis XVIII. He's exiled, I think, to Austria first, or he goes to Austria first, and then eventually ends up in Britain, but he bounces around a bunch of European kingdoms. It's the same thing for the other Bourbon prospect, which is the Comte d'Artois, Charles, who would eventually become Charles X. But yeah, ultimately, despite a lot of the promises and a lot of scheming, there is not much real appetite for reviving the Bourbons. And what do I mean by, like, a real appetite? Well, there's paying lip service to the Bourbons and the émigrés, as was done by the Prussians, Austrians, British, Russians, Neapolitans, all of them. And they were talking about restoring France to the way it was in order to get some émigré backing. And then there's the actual practicality of making that happen. Austria and Prussia especially had some serious reservations about actually restoring the Bourbons. Russia wanted emigre officers for its army and so promised a lot, but wasn't really in any position to deliver. The Bourbons of Italy and Spain rolled over the moment the French really put pressure on them. So there wasn't really a possibility of a third Bourbon-led way there, like the Bourbons self-actualizing and using some of their own resources in other Bourbon kingdoms. Britain is the only power to seriously push for a Bourbon restoration, but really only as a cover to overthrow the French Republic. Like, they're not wedded to the Bourbons specifically. It's more a restoration of monarchy in general. Actually, that's probably the way to phrase it. The coalition was not fighting to restore the Bourbons, but to beat the French Republic. So if the Republic was beaten before 1800, what came next likely would have been a Bourbon restoration. But yeah, actually making that happen, very difficult. Would it have been stable? I don't think so. The Bourbons at home, as we've seen, are responsible for causing revolution. And abroad, they're seen as starting a general European war. So the Orléans might have been a sort of good alternative. They would have been in with a shout as a sort of a liberal-leaning royal family without any of the baggage. But as far as how Napoleon factors into this, it's maybe as like a stable third-way candidate, which indeed is the way France actually ended up going historically. Like a bolt of lightning strikes him, he's gone before 1800. It's hard to see the French Republic doing anything more than just sort of chugging along. Like Napoleon was, after all, one general, a very good one, but just one general of a couple hundred, and not a really truly important mover or shaker in politics until like 1799. So yeah, it seems like things would just chug along fine without him. As for your second question, which is what's the biggest mistake of Napoleon's life? Leaving Corsica. No. This is one of those classic Napoleon questions to which I don't honestly have an answer. Mostly because I don't really find it useful for myself to think of things that Napoleon did as successes or failures, but just as decisions. But of all the big Napoleonic, quote, mistakes, if I had to pick one, it'd be Haiti. It stands out as a spectacular blunder with no redeeming features, and one where even having read what Napoleon's reasoning was and a lot of context and assessments, I still don't understand what he was going for. Adar Shedav asks if the destruction of the Napoleonic Wars is often overlooked. Absolutely yes, which is always the case in any series of books or source or whatever that gives a general history of the era, but the Napoleonic Wars were an extremely disruptive and traumatic time for millions of people, the vast majority of whom were civilians, whose experience of the war was sons and family members conscripted, livestock taken, starvation, their homes occupied, towns destroyed and damaged, disruption of trade, epidemics, looting, banditry, desertion, rebellion. I could go on. And then, of course, it's worse, as you point out, in those parts of Italy, namely southern Italy, and of course also Eastern Europe, where systematic looting, violent repression, reprisal, raising of settlements and atrocities all occurred. Same with Spain and Portugal too, where the French were brutal at times. So yeah, in focusing purely on armies and wars, it's very easy to miss the human cost, but any serious study of the period has to grapple with that reality. Enlot, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, has a question about the significance of 13 Vendemaire. Specifically, if without it, would Napoleon have been noticed and promoted? Well, Paul Barras was aware of Napoleon before Vendemaire, from his time as a representative of a mission, I believe, at Toulon, and also from correspondence he had with Napoleon, mostly on military matters. But none of that's remarkable, like it was both men doing their jobs. Cambacérès only had a passing knowledge of Napoleon, again, nothing remarkable. So in the absence of Vendemaire or some other similar sort of emergency, yes, it does seem likely Napoleon might have just gone largely under the radar, or at the very least had a more typical path for promotion, rather than the immediate appointment, the immediate acceleration as what, the head of the Army of the Interior, and then eventually the Army of Italy. But yeah, Napoleon certainly sought to gain from presenting himself to the government at Vendemaire, and he wouldn't have done it if there was nothing on offer. Millennium Star asks what would have happened for the Ottoman Empire if Napoleon had chosen to join their army. So Napoleon very early on in his career floated the idea of going to the Ottoman Empire as a mercenary officer, an artillery expert, specifically when he was in some fairly boring assignments with the Topographic Bureau. I think also maybe early on when he was like still in or just barely out of Brienne. But once Napoleon has an active position as an active general in Italy, all this talk fades away. So it's hard not to see it as anything more than Napoleon just venting to family and friends. Like imagining himself in some, interesting alternate scenario. But I'll pop some examples up from his letters, but the obvious interpretation is that he's just being flippant. That being said, what if he does? And there was a realistic chance for Napoleon to end up in the Ottoman Empire, and that would have been as a foreign advisor or an attaché officer, if it was through the auspices of being a French officer as well. Probably in a similar way to as happened with Horace Sebastiani. Insinuated in a couple of letters to Joseph, especially, a proposal to seek permission they both go. He as a military advisor, Joseph in some diplomatic or advisory capacity. But again, how serious Napoleon was, who knows? I don't know enough about the inner workings of the Ottoman Empire at this stage to get into the detail about what impact he might have had. But as you do point out, it was a time of reform, and if Napoleon had taken the plunge, he might have really enjoyed the chance to put a lot of skills to the test, skills he wasn't necessarily using in France when he's thinking about this. But yeah, ultimately it would have been a very different life, one where Napoleon was kind of one among many. There were a lot of foreign officers, a lot of French officers too, who served service in foreign armies like the Russian army, the Ottoman army, during this era, some of whom were successful, most of whom were not, or at least are forgotten. So there's a chance that Napoleon goes down as some fairly obscure artillery expert that participated in some battles and skirmishes in the Middle East. Actually, thinking about it now, some things would really count against him, because Napoleon was not very good with languages. He was pretty combative at times. He probably would have been able to, skirt by with his expertise, but actually carving out a place of power for himself and influence for himself, he would have probably found that pretty difficult. Enloe asks two separate questions about Napoleon, which I'll combine because my answer links both of them in. So firstly, would France have been better off as a republic, presumably still with Napoleon as Premier Consul? It's impossible to say if overall it would be better. It's also a bit of a can of worms. So barring any domestic or political changes or consequences of this, on a purely diplomatic front, staying a republic would still be very dangerous for France. The French Republic as a revolutionary republic, a post-revolutionary state, was always going to be perceived as a threat. And it was also very misunderstood in its objectives by its enemies. And this is where we start to bleed into question 2, as this was part of Napoleon's logic, becoming, self-serving though it was, to become an empire. France might actually be recast in the eyes of other European powers as a peer power. It was also an overt way to signal to them that the revolution was complete, which again was hoped to be enough to get everyone to calm down. But your point about limiting France's extent is closer to the actual way war might have been prevented, but the Adige and the Rhine are still well into Britain and Austria's zones of interest, and so they would press for 1792 borders, likely 1789 borders, which is ultimately cause for war as France, as Napoleon, would not accept. Ultimately, there's actually not really much difference between France being an empire or a republic under Napoleon. He rules it the same way, same mechanisms, probably a lot of the same people, same institutions, same constitution. It'd be more about the window dressing, the branding, and I suppose the democratic electoral precedent of being a republic, whereas an empire is all about hierarchy. And more to the second question now, did Napoleon stray from his principles in founding an empire? This is one of those few enduring Napoleonic debates, how honest Napoleon ever was about his political principles in the first place in the decade or so from his emergence onto the political scene as a Jacobin, as a consummate Republican, publicly in favour of electoralism and representative institutions, etc. And then the Napoleon who, when in control, consolidates power, subsumes many functions of representative institutions into the executive, and later largely abolishes all but the figment of representation and democracy. But yeah, it's a huge debate, huge topic, which I'm not going to cover in detail in this question, but certainly in a video eventually, like when we get to the end of the episodes, doing a bit more of like a Napoleon retrospective and analysis. But I've always followed the through line of Napoleon's more like elemental belief in authority, and he does assert and mostly adhere to the principle that authority, whatever its form, like republic, empire, whatever, he doesn't really care. He cares that it should be popular, mostly. Now, whether that's the popular support assured by institutions of a republic or an empire, I don't think, Napoleon's particular, except to say that maybe an empire is a better tool for wielding authority, again, because it's hierarchical. It's top-down. Abdurrahman Kuchuk asks if the Reign of Terror was inevitable. That's a tough one. The Reign of Terror was state-led, state-sanctioned violence against potential threats to the revolution in an attempt to limit the effectiveness of uncontrolled and sort of uncontained populist violence from the Enragés and sponsored also by the Paris Commune. And trying to put that carriage of justice back into the hands of the courts, like an official institution. And then there's the impetus behind it of France being in a state of legitimate national emergency. So for the Reign of Terror not to happen, you'd need to get rid of the underlying causes for non-state-led populist violence, and then to prevent there being a war. So how to stop mob violence? Somehow clamping down on the Paris Commune or undermining the demagogues and Enragés. Can't even begin to imagine how that was possible. It might at least help preventing the war as well, because the foreign plot would have had less traction, and therefore there'd be less popular agitation in Paris in favour of, extrajudicial violence. But yeah, one of those historical what ifs that requires you to move a lot of pieces around, and ultimately you end up at a point where it's, I don't know, very tough to do. Ed116898 asks why I think Robespierre didn't sue for peace in 1794. There's two parts to this. Number one, Robespierre wasn't all-powerful, and the decision to pursue peace would have had to have been a decision from the Committee of Public Safety. Secondly, they did try. They tried with the Austrians especially, but they weren't interested. Nobody at this stage has any idea where the wars are going. And Austria, some setbacks aside, they still have plenty of gas in the tank to keep fighting. And the Prussians do too, but for them it's a lack of political will. With the Russians and British backing Austria to the max, they had no reason to want peace, ideologically or materially. The war-sustaining logic itself isn't really there either, as the French are only just beginning to gain any real traction into the Rhineland and Netherlands, but the whole process is still very painful and expensive. Like, peace to the villages, war on the castles was a response to the conditions of the war, not a justification for continuing them. Like, France wasn't raking in the dough from its occupations, but it was sort of kind of breaking even, breaking even's wrong. It was offsetting the worst of the pain. It was like, going from a compound fracture to like a bad break, something like that. Robespierre, as you do point out, was opposed to Brissot's belligerence, but was also aware much of his position was owed to the emergency conditions of war. If that was gone, it would be a fair guess he'd lose position or influence, but did that mean he wouldn't want peace? No. I mean, Robespierre is pretty deeply misunderstood. A lot of what he wanted was stuff only possible by his own admission in peacetime. So I can't see why his ideology would have created the obstinacy needed to stop him from accepting peace. If he lost influence once the war was over, sure, that wouldn't be ideal for him. But again, he would still be, de facto head of the Committee of Public Safety, like one of the best positioned politicians in the Republic. Enlo asks when Louis XVI could have changed the course of the French Revolution. Without getting into any what-ifs that would require a whole different course of events, the earliest and most realistic chance for Louis is at the very start of the revolution, either before the National Assembly has been formed or just after it has, doing something then, because that's when he still at least has some royal authority to exert. But aside from that, he could have called the Estates General earlier and probably on his terms, rather than doing so under duress, and then try to assert a very rapidly waning authority on them. But yeah, Louis was mercurial, defaulted to indecision, adopted very contradictory, half measures, took advice really quite haphazardly, and then he was randomly seized with just this defiance and energy at the worst possible times. He would have had to have been a very different person, a very different king, to do anything to change the course of history. But even then, he was just one man, and the forces of revolution in France long predated Louis, and they're institutional, structural, not related at all to his personality. So even if Louis was an effective king, he would only have been delaying the inevitable. Though perhaps, again, an old history, stern Louis, stronger Louis, could have kept the monarchy intact, but it certainly would have been a constitutional monarchy, and that was unpalatable to him. John Hutchinson asks if I think the French Empire could have positioned itself to avoid the wars of the coalition, or were they on a doomed course? Well, the problem here is that the coalition wars predate Napoleon, and they were aimed at least initially, overthrowing the revolutionary government in Paris, and then once that was a military impossibility, at least just containing its spread. So by the time Napoleon does become consul, France is in a decent position militarily and diplomatically, but largely because of the results of active conquest and subjugation in the years prior. So short of literally reneging on all treaties of alliance and withdrawing to pre-1792 borders, and then even then with no guarantees, only then might Napoleon have avoided the coalition wars. But, possibly there's a middle ground where he keeps Italy and stays in conflict with just Austria, but gives up the Netherlands to appease Britain, sort of driving a wedge in the coalition. But how long that appeasement lasts with Britain, that's pretty doubtful. And then there's the interventionist streak of the Tsars and the pressure that would be put on Prussia to commit troops. It's one of those mutual disarmament situations, and I can't really see Napoleon voluntarily breaking up the French Empire in the face of a potential coalition, even if he had the power to do it, considering the backlash it would generate, and also the fact that it would leave France possibly very vulnerable. And when you say that the French Empire is on a collision course with its own destruction, yeah, absolutely. It's in the nature of empires to expand in order to gain the resources or space to protect themselves, and then that creates the conditions for a never-ending cycle of further expansion, and eventually it does all come crashing down. There's only a certain amount of space to expand or a certain amount of resources you can acquire. So it does explain from the point of view of the coalition powers why they were so fearful of a French Empire, because even when at peace, it does look fairly threatening, and therefore it's hard to imagine a scenario where they don't go to war with France, or at least where they're antagonistic with France. But that being said, there were a couple of points like in 1802 and 1807, 1810 when things started quietening down, where it did look like a general peace was possible, and when a new status quo might have taken root. John's question bleeds into the next question from Matthew Shaw, who asks if there were any points in the Napoleonic Wars where peace with Britain was possible. Yes, it was possible. As we've seen, there were a couple of proper peace attempts, like some successful peace accords with Britain, but the problem was always the same, and that was the stability and durability of that peace. Britain's justification for fighting France at the time during the wars was couched in, at first, containing this aberrant French Republic, and then once Napoleon really gets going, it's liberating the nations he's taken. Self-serving though that logic was, but yeah, they couch it in sort of liberation terms. That being said, the real underlying logic is economic, as Britain ultimately benefited mightily from European free trade, like free trade with the continent, free trade through especially the Low Countries. So a continentally dominant France, no matter who leads it, threatened that trade, and Napoleon explicitly threatens it rhetorically and in action. So without Britain and France having the military resources to beat each other, they do inch towards peace when conflict dies down on the continent. Helped along, of course, by war weariness on both sides. But yeah, the years 1802, 1807, 1810, they're not coincidental. 1802 and the Third Coalition has been beaten. 1807, Treaty of Tilsit. 1810 and Austria is defeated again. So it's at those points when Britain can't fight with a continental ally that peace is most likely. But again, the core economic rationale, as well as the search for a continental partner, they haven't gone anywhere. So peace prospects are fleeting in that sense. Juan Reyes asks about revisionism on the Napoleonic era. So yeah, certainly there is a lot of revisionism, but I wouldn't put any stock in it. But you're absolutely right that Austerlitz specifically is often signaled out as like an actually Napoleon wasn't that great sort of moment. But my question whenever I see anything like that, like a hot take, is A, how much is it contrarianism? And then B, is the person making this claim qualified in any way to make that claim? Like, of course, everybody's got their right to an opinion, no matter how contrarian or how bad it is, whatever. But is it being said with any kind of authority backing it? Or have they, as I usually see, like skimmed a Wikipedia article or regurgitated like a lame opinion from Reddit or something? Like, gatekeepy though it is, there is a reason historians and academics do the history, and most people swim in the waters of pop history, because the work of cataloguing, analyzing, understanding, and then actually finally like publishing is very, very hard. Usually pretty unrewarding work. And it's a lot easier to just say like Wellington was a hack, so-and-so was terrible, to just get a reaction. The Napoleonic Wars are very fortunate and unfortunate in a sense in its historiography. Fortunate in the sense that it's very accessible. You know, one of the most intensively studied and sourced and written about periods of human history, like plenty of primary sources, literally at this point as well, 2 centuries of academic discussion and discourse, from which there's a lot of room for interesting conversations. And it also has a broadly settled, fairly uncontentious consensus, which gives a sort of nice baseline. But this does cause another problem where, because it's so accessible, people enter into it through usually pop history and media depictions that are generally unrealistic, they're unacademic, and disconnected from a meaningful, larger discussion, and that certainly creates the basis for a lot of strange revisionism. Like, I personally have seen people justifying, or at least hypothesizing, using stuff they've seen in video games or movies or bad history videos, which is deeply unhelpful. And also notably, the language for a lot of revisionism is very online. Like, was Napoleon overrated? Top 10 worst mistakes? Why Napoleon shouldn't have invaded Spain, etc. Which immediately sets the spidey senses tingling. But that being said, we have to make the space for well-intentioned revisionism, ideally from a place of authority, so mostly academic stuff here. And we're still in the midst of a lot of ongoing debates and discussions on any number of Napoleonic or Napoleon-related, Napoleon-adjacent topics that are worth having. Like, your examples about the Spanish monarchy are 100% relevant. There's also plenty of ongoing analysis of La Grande Armée's retreat through Germany and of French control in places like Illyria, Naples, Greece. Academic discourse like that is entirely separate from the sort of usual strain of contrarianism, usually internet-based discussion. And it's positive, ultimately very positive. Leo Farm asks if I'm going to do a series on Napoleon III. The answer is probably. I plan to just plod my way chronologically through French history unless someone stops me. So we'll get to Mr. Moustache eventually. But I wouldn't do it as a series on him specifically. I'd focus on it be more general, I should say, about the Second Empire. As for French colonization and involvement in Indochina, absolutely, that series would cover it. Just as it would for Africa, Madagascar, Algeria, Mexico, Syria, Egypt, India, China. I think that's all the colonial expeditions, maybe. Most of them anyway. But yeah, there are a lot of big French colonial expeditions in the 19th and 20th centuries. But I suppose, unfortunately, from your point of view, I wouldn't be doing anything super detailed from the Vietnamese, Laotian, Hmong, Cambodian perspectives. Everything would run through the French perspective and be more simplistic for it. But that being said, I'm pretty good about balanced sourcing, so, there wouldn't be nothing. And also, your English is perfect, better than my Vietnamese at any rate. Lane Hennifer has a related question about the Second Empire. Would I ever do videos on its military? Yes, I'd have to, but when we get around to it. It's easy enough, as there's no shortage of imagery or sources for it, so yeah, I'd definitely do it. Bonnie Prince Charlie asks about my thoughts on Friederich of Prussia's war record. I wouldn't say I've got a particularly unique opinion or that much to say. Friederich was very ambitious, probably bit off more than he could chew. The historical consensus on him now vaguely makes sense of a lot of odd decisions or very risky decisions he made at the time. Like, he probably bit off more than he could chew and got quite lucky that his enemies made their own very strange decisions. But I respect the high risk, high reward sort of play. He also benefited from having a very good army, courtesy of his dad. But his campaigns in Silesia are held in very high regard, justifiably, even though, again, they were a lot closer run than it's generally remembered. Like, Austria had hands, which is often forgotten. They're kind of like, a bit like happens in the Napoleonic Wars. It's sort of like they're seen as a punching bag or a joke. They weren't. They were a proper opponent. But yeah, if anything, that also speaks positively to Friedrich because he beat them. He beat a strong enemy. Enlo asks when France fell behind Britain in colonial pursuits and points out the 7 Years' War as the turning point. And yes, I'd have to agree with that. Specifically the Treaty of Paris in 1763. So France cedes its North American colonies, part of its Caribbean colonies, and generally submits to being a second-rate colonial player as compared to Britain. But then again, it's all relative. Like, Britain was already well on the path of outstripping and outperforming any of their colonial opponents. Those opponents being, obviously, France, but also the Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese. I guess eventually, technically, the Americans too. Like, it also helped Britain that while their trajectory is on the upswing, both the Portuguese and Spanish empires are well past their prime, and they're very poorly managed. So resulting in Spain's case and like the the actual total collapse of their empire a couple of decades later. The Dutch fared a bit better and were legitimate commercial threats to Britain overseas, but the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars neutered their empire. So in the areas where they were competing directly with Britain, it just sort of, again, kind of got ablated off the face of the earth. France recovered some colonial standing in the years after the 7 Years' War, of course, by supporting American independence and leveraging the commercial value of their remaining colonies, Saint-Domingue in particular. But as we've seen, that recovery is stopped pretty much dead in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars because they can't maintain contact with their colonies. Like, Napoleon's gambits to revive the colonial empire all fail very expensively, and the loss to or occupation by the British of existing French colonies, much like with the Dutch colonies like South Africa and Ceylon, puts the French colonial empire like 2 or more decades behind Britain. Like, it can't be overstated how much of a boon time this period was for Britain in terms of its empire. Like, they were contested and had plenty of failures, but were undoubtedly the dominant naval and commercial power from, like, say, 1790. By the time the wars are over and France and Britain are at peace, the Bourbons pursue a very conservative foreign policy, and so it's not until the 1840s that France returns in earnest to the colonial game, by which point Britain has been without a serious rival for at least 50 years. Ben asks about my greatest shame, the missing episode 3 of the French Revolution series. So yeah, she's my one that got away. It was meant to be, I guess it theoretically still could be, about the Enlightenment, but as I was researching it and writing it, I got very carried away and I realized it was too massive of a topic for one video. Now, if I were doing it, I would strip it down to just let's make it like just some concepts. Like, let's strip out a couple of concepts to apply to the French Revolution, but I didn't do that. But funnily enough, I was just perusing not too long ago some of my old stuff and reread the partial script for it. But yeah, like it'd have to be liberalism, rationalism, absolutism, national sovereignty. Like my problem when I was originally writing it was I was actually doing the proper sources and reading Leviathan and the Rights of Man and taking out quotes, and that was overdoing it. But then again, I don't know, it pains me not to have proper context and detail like that, but I don't know, who knows, one day I might do it, we'll see. I definitely would like to do topics on Enlightenment topics and Enlightenment subjects as well on the channel. Le Lavarino asks about the Patreon fees. Honestly, I haven't looked at it in a very long time, so whatever it says and whatever it charges, let it be. Better that it's on the lower end. Like I set and forget it pretty much at the start. I feel very sheepish about getting money from people, and so I don't want to ask very much. So honestly, I'm just very surprised and embarrassed, honestly, and thankful too that people will donate any money at all. Trevor Troop asks about languages. Yes, I speak French okay. I've taken proper in-person lessons for a couple of years, and I can read the sources near fluently, like certainly enough to get by without Google Translate like 80-90% of the time. Like I literally only started learning so I could read the sources in French, specifically Napoleon's letters. Like I had a book of translated excerpts, but I wanted to go to the actual, the OGs. But I generally cite or source an English translation for quoting, as those are the ones I expect you, the audience, to be able to access. And then as for other languages, I have a bit of high school German, and I can kind of brute force my way through some of the Romance languages, like Italian. I can just brute force through. German sources have been very crucial for some of the more specific topics, as you'd expect, on Austria and Prussia, but I don't want to relearn the 9 different cases for thee again, so I'll just plug those into a translator. And final question, Henry Johnson asks what I'd write about in a historical fiction story on the Napoleonic Wars. I don't know if I'd do anything but large scale, like I'd do like a short story, novella sort of thing. I'll probably get a couple of short stories in me, but I'd be a lot more interested in exploring diplomatic topics or like something spy, espionage related, maybe naval even, like, the Aubrey Maturin series is personal favorite. So there's something more like, obscure. Obviously got Sharp. Again, that's sort of like more sweeping, and they're not short stories. They're proper big anthology novels. But if you did do like about a soldier, I don't know, vignettes of their life might be interesting. Especially if you could riff a bit and do like, fake letters home. Yeah. But why not just do that for like a naval captain? That'd be more interesting. You could see half the world that way, as opposed to your little corner of Europe for the duration of a campaign. But yeah, I think my preference would actually be a diplomatic or something espionage related. All right, and that does it for Q&A 2. There will be a third after the next episode, which is, and I can't believe I'm saying this, done. So I get to actually release something on a schedule for a change. Genuinely, this is the first time. But yeah, then after that, we're doing Napoleon back in Spain, Battle of Somosierra, and then eventually War of the Fifth Coalition, going back and kicking a little bit of Austrian ass. And I'm also going to do other follow-on episodes for the Grande Armée topics. So the next one in the pipeline there is artillery. That one's like 80% written. And I've also been thinking I should probably do equivalent ones now for Britain and Austria, because their armies are about to become very relevant in short order. But yeah, that's it. So until then, have a good one.